Big Shaq thought he was hiding the biggest secret of his life. A marriage. A vow. A love born in silence. When Big Shaq secretly married a homeless woman, the world could only guess at the truth. But when the homeless woman finally revealed her real identity, the shock echoed everywhere. What was the truth hidden behind Big Shaq and the homeless woman's forbidden love? Let's uncover the story that left everyone speechless. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. In the sprawling brightness of Los Angeles, under a sky so blue it seemed painted by gods themselves, Shaquille O'Neal walked alone through Lincoln Park. It was the kind of day when millionaires usually hid inside their glass towers or yachts. But Shaq, despite every privilege life had handed him, felt suffocated by the walls money had built around him. His towering figure moved slowly, almost reluctantly, past playgrounds and crowded benches, the weight in his chest heavier than any basketball he'd ever hoisted. On the surface, Shaq's life sparkled. He was adored, a living legend, a giant of generosity. Yet inside, a loneliness gnawed at him like rust eating through steel. The crowds loved Big Shaq, but none of them knew Shaquille, the man beneath the myths, the soul who hungered for something real, something untouched by fame's poison. It was then, at the edge of the cracked fountain, where pigeons bickered over crumbs, that he saw her. She was sitting cross-legged on the concrete, her hair a tangled storm around her face, a faded army jacket drowning her small frame. Around her, people flowed like water around a stone, their gazes carefully averted. One socked foot poked out from the layers of torn denim. Her hands, cracked and calloused, twisted a small thread between her fingers, focused entirely on the tiny, fragile task. Shaq found himself stopping mid-step. He didn't know why. There was nothing outwardly remarkable about her. Homelessness wasn't rare here. He had donated millions to shelters, spoken at fundraisers, even toured the projects firsthand. But this was different. There was something in the way she sat, something whole yet broken, proud yet invisible. A sudden gust of wind lifted the thread from her fingers, spinning it like a silver strand into the air. She watched it float away without moving, her face unreadable. Shaq felt a lump form in his throat. He took a slow step forward, then another. He didn't speak. The park was already full of empty words. Instead, he crouched down beside her, ignoring the wary looks from passers-by. She turned toward him, and for a second their eyes locked. What Shaq saw wrecked him. Her eyes weren't begging, weren't angry, weren't defeated. They were ancient, stormy, hiding a story too big for her small frame. He wanted to say something grand, something world-changing, but all that came out was a simple, "You hungry?" The woman blinked once, slowly, as if awakening from a long sleep. Then she gave a tiny nod. No tears, no dramatic gratitude. Just a nod, like a queen accepting an offering. Shaq smiled crookedly and offered her a hand. For the briefest flicker of a moment, hesitation shadowed her face. Then, with a courage he recognized immediately, she reached up and took it. He didn't take her to some flashy restaurant or mansion. Instead, he bought 2 hot dogs from a street vendor who barely glanced at them, wrapped in greasy paper that stained their fingers. They sat side by side on a splintered park bench, eating in silence. Around them, life rolled on, kids screaming, skateboards rattling, dogs barking. But inside that little bubble of cracked concrete and city dust, something rare and golden grew. Shaq didn't ask her name. He didn't ask why she was homeless, or what her story was. He just sat with her, feeling strangely lighter with every passing minute. She didn't talk much either. A few words here and there about the weather, about how pigeons fought dirtier than humans, about how the sun was kinder when you didn't own a roof. Hours blurred into each other. Eventually the sun began to dip, and the city shifted into its nighttime skin. Shaq stood reluctantly, brushing hot dog crumbs from his massive hands. She rose too, brushing nothing from her empty jeans. He hesitated, heart pounding harder than it ever had on any championship night. Then he said it, raw and clumsy. "You got anywhere safe to sleep tonight?" Her lips twisted into something that could have been a smile or a grimace. "Safe?" she echoed, voice hoarse from disuse. "Safe's expensive in this city." That's when the decision sparked inside him. Reckless, wild, pure. A choice so insane he could almost hear the future headlines screaming. But none of that mattered. In her, Shaq saw something worth more than reputation. Something worth saving. Not because she was broken, but because she was whole in ways he could barely understand. "I got space," he said, voice low but steady. Not looking for anything. Just a place to rest. You deserve that much. For the first time, she really looked at him. Deep, searching, weighing something invisible. Then, with a shrug that carried the weight of survival, she said, "A place to rest sounds real good." That night, Shaq smuggled a homeless woman into his sprawling estate under the cover of darkness. A move that would later ignite wildfire through every corner of his life. He gave her a guest room, untouched, immaculate, but she chose instead to sleep on the floor, curled in a blanket like a cat too cautious to trust a bed. Shaq didn't push her. He just sat outside the door until he heard the slow, steady breathing of someone finally safe enough to sleep. As he sat there in the dark, leaning his giant frame against the hallway wall, Shaq realized he hadn't felt this kind of peace in years. His empire, his trophies, his fortune, none of it had filled the hollow space inside him. But this small, fierce woman with her battle-scarred spirit had cracked him wide open. In the silence, a single thought bloomed inside him, reckless and terrifying. What if he didn't just help her for a night? What if he gave her a real chance, a life, a future, maybe even love? Shaq closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision settle into his bones. Tomorrow, he knew, he would do something nobody would understand. Tomorrow he would take a step that would cost him everything the world valued, but might give him everything his soul needed. The giant's heart, long guarded behind walls of fame and fortune, had finally broken wide open, and nothing would ever be the same again. The morning after bringing Cassandra into his home, Shaq woke with a decision burning inside him, one that logic screamed against but his heart had already embraced. The world he lived in ran on suspicion and status, contracts and appearances, but standing outside Cassandra's door that night had shown him how brittle all of it was. He had given pieces of himself to people who only loved the myth, not the man. Here, for the first time in years, was someone who didn't need him to be Big Shaq. She barely seemed to care about who he was at all. Maybe that was why he trusted her more than anyone else. The city stretched out under a pale sun that morning, a blanket of soft gold over battered sidewalks and endless glass towers. Shaq made a few quiet calls, pulling on old favors from people who still owed him pieces of loyalty. No press, no publicity, no grand spectacle. He didn't need tuxedos, towering cakes, or million-dollar floral arrangements. He needed a promise, something raw, something untouched by the glitter of his false world. Cassandra woke to the smell of coffee brewing. Her hair was a tangled crown, her clothes still clinging to her slight frame like a battlefield's last flag. She blinked at him, distrust flickering behind her calm face, as he set the steaming cup in front of her, the simple ceramic mug so shockingly normal inside his palatial kitchen. He didn't propose with a diamond ring, or down on one knee. Instead, in a voice rough and unsure, Shaq asked her if she would stand by him. No promises of wealth, no sweetened lies about happily ever after. Just a plain question, heavy with truth. Cassandra studied him for a long moment, sipping the coffee with hands that still shook faintly from years of cold nights and colder betrayals. Then she set the mug down, licked her cracked lips, and nodded. A decision made without fanfare, but with a dignity that brought a burning behind Shaq's eyes. The ceremony happened that afternoon, under a frayed canopy at the edge of an old garden, attached to a tiny community chapel, forgotten by the city around it. The old minister wore a rumpled suit, and smelled faintly of pipe smoke, his voice steady and kind as he led them through the words that would bind their lives together. There were no guests, only two groundskeepers who paused their raking to watch curiously from the shadows of an ancient oak tree. Shaq wore a plain black jacket. Cassandra, a simple blue sundress Shaq's housekeeper had insisted on buying her. It hung loose over her thin frame, but when the sunlight caught her face, there was something royal in her posture, something fierce that no designer fabric could have captured. They spoke their vows quietly, voices barely rising above the whisper of wind, stirring the dust. There were no grand declarations, only the steady murmur of two people daring to believe in something the world had already dismissed. When the minister finally said, "You may kiss the bride," Shaq merely touched his forehead to hers, the contact electric sacred, sealing a bond thicker than contracts or cameras could ever hope to capture. The walk back to the car was silent. The city didn't stop, or notice. No helicopters swirled overhead. No paparazzi scrambled for hidden angles. It was exactly what Shaq had wanted. Sacred, secret, his. But secrets, especially ones born from the defiance of public expectation, don't stay buried for long. By the next morning, the quiet hum of suspicion had already begun inside Shaq's inner circle. His longtime business manager, Curtis Langston, first sensed it. Curtis, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, wasn't the kind of man to ignore sudden changes. When Shaq missed a scheduled sponsor shoot, citing personal obligations, Curtis's instincts went cold. He had built Shaq's brand into a titan, and now something threatened the empire. Something personal, dangerous, and deeply unpredictable. Then came Lucille O'Neill, Shaq's mother, the iron backbone of his upbringing. When she arrived unannounced at the estate, her hands on her hips and her stare burning with questions, Cassandra was sitting quietly in the back garden, weaving fallen twigs into crude bracelets. Lucille's gaze swept over the newcomer, taking in every scar, every hardened line. She didn't speak a word, but the judgment hung heavy in the air, thicker than the humid afternoon heat. Inside, behind the heavy oak doors of the study, Lucille confronted her son with a fury born from fear. She spoke of appearances, of protecting his name, of legacy and bloodlines, and the dangers of blind compassion. Shaq listened, shoulders rigid, fists tight at his sides. He knew Lucille wasn't heartless. She had fought monsters in her own time to raise him up from nothing. But this wasn't about reputation for him. This was about something bigger than brand deals and public image. This was about saving himself from the rot that fame had planted deep in his soul. News moved through his circle, like wildfire. Friends stopped answering calls. Endorsement deals whispered threats. Invitations to high-end events quietly dried up. To them, Shaq's choice wasn't romantic. It was reckless. Pathetic even. A man of his stature, bringing home a stray like a wounded bird, wedding her without so much as a prenup. Madness. Whispers grew louder, swirling into sharp-edged rumors. Some said she had trapped him, a schemer hiding behind a pretty broken face. Others insisted Shaq was spiraling, that the loneliness had finally eaten through his common sense. Even Curtis, once Shaq's staunchest defender, began planting seeds of doubt, urging Shaq to consider an annulment, to fix this before it grew into a scandal he couldn't control. But every time Shaq looked at Cassandra, really looked, he saw none of the manipulations the world warned him about. He saw a woman clinging stubbornly to dignity after everything had been stripped away from her. He saw a survivor who hadn't asked for his name or his fortune, only for a moment's kindness that had somehow spiraled into salvation for them both. Still, the pressure mounted, each day bringing new cracks in the fortress Shaq had built around his life. Journalists started sniffing around. Paparazzi camped at the gates. Shaq doubled security, restricted access to his property, but the world's hunger for a fall from grace was ravenous. It wasn't just external pressures. Inside the house, tension simmered. Cassandra, despite her quiet strength, struggled against the walls that luxury built around her. She moved through the halls like a ghost, careful not to touch the expensive furniture, always half ready to be thrown out. She refused to let the staff serve her, often retreating to the servants' quarters to eat alone. Her independence, once admirable, now gnawed at Shaq's heart. He hadn't just married her to save her. He had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that she would find a way to save him too. One evening, under a bruised sunset bleeding across the sky, Shaq found her sitting on the back porch, knees drawn up to her chest, staring at nothing. The silence stretched between them, thick with words neither dared speak. He wanted to tell her he didn't care about the rumors, the lost endorsements, the sneers from friends who had never really been friends. He wanted to tell her she was enough. But even giants have fears they can't voice. The truth was, a darker question had begun gnawing at the edges of his mind. A question he hated himself for even entertaining. Who was Cassandra Reed before the streets claimed her? And what price would he pay for never asking until now? In the fading light, Big Shaq, a man who could silence stadiums with a glance, sat paralyzed by a single terrifying thought. What if the scandal hadn't even begun yet? The morning after the vows were exchanged, the world beyond Shaq's gates remained oblivious. But inside, a storm was already forming. In the endless polished corridors of his mansion, whispers moved like cold drafts slipping under locked doors. Where once there had been laughter and loyalty, now suspicion brewed in every glance, in every unfinished sentence cut short when Shaq entered the room. Shaq felt it first from the staff. People who had known him for years suddenly kept their heads bowed, a little lower, their smiles a little tighter. The housekeeper, once a motherly figure who fussed over him like a beloved nephew, now looked through him when they crossed paths. The chef began preparing meals for one again, as if Cassandra's presence was temporary, a mistake soon to be corrected. Lucille O'Neill, Shaq's anchor through every storm life had ever thrown, visited less frequently. When she did come, she spoke little, and watched Cassandra like a hawk sizing up an intruder. Shaq hated seeing the worry etched deeper into his mother's face, hated knowing she saw his marriage not as salvation, but as self-destruction. Yet he could not explain the certainty he carried in his chest, that loving Cassandra, trusting her, was the most right thing he had ever done. Still, certainty is a poor shield against gossip. It wasn't long before the first ripples began to reach the world outside. Shaq's management team called emergency meetings with an urgency usually reserved for lawsuits or medical crises. Curtis Langston, once the architect of Shaq's invincible image, paced the boardroom, a storm bottled inside his designer suit. "We're bleeding sponsors," Curtis said grimly, slapping down a stack of printouts. Under Armour's getting nervous. PepsiCo's starting to ask questions. "You're becoming a risk, Shaq. An unpredictable, reckless risk." Shaq sat silent, massive hands folded in front of him, listening to the phrases thrown like stones: brand integrity, public perception, controlled narratives. None of it touched the core of why he had made his choice. They talked about him like he was a product, a stock portfolio dipping under the weight of bad headlines, yet to come. Curtis wasn't finished. His voice lowered, lethal with a blade of suggestion. "You need to end this, quietly, before the real damage starts." Shaq stood slowly, his chair scraping the floor in a screech that cut off Curtis's next words. For a moment he said nothing, letting the size of his disappointment fill the room. Then, without anger, without raising his voice, he said, "She's my wife." The finality of it settled over the room like dust over forgotten dreams. Behind the walls of Shaq's estate, Cassandra Reed moved like a ghost caught between two worlds. She never touched the luxuries surrounding her. She wore the same few sets of clothes, rotating them like armor against a world she could not afford to trust. Her eyes, those dark, mournful eyes, held a sadness that made even the sunniest afternoons feel overcast. Shaq tried to reach her. He bought her clothes, books, even a battered upright piano, hoping to coax music back into her life. But Cassandra smiled thinly, thanked him politely, and drifted further away each time. Shaq realized with a sick knot in his stomach that she didn't know how to belong in a place built on gold and glass. Worse, part of her didn't seem to want. Word spread beyond his inner circle with wildfire speed. The media, deprived of facts, gorged themselves on speculation. Tabloids spat out theories. Cassandra was a con artist, a runaway, a secret addict, a former escort. Shaq's refusal to comment only fanned the flames higher. Even the more respectable outlets began running think pieces questioning Shaq's mental stability and judgment lapses. Anchors who once called him a hero now nodded grimly over footage of his wedding day, speculating if the beloved giant had finally fallen prey to loneliness and bad choices. Inside the mansion, the tension became a living thing. Cassandra barely ate. She avoided the gardens where cameras could see her. She stopped sleeping in the guest room and curled up instead on the bare wooden floor of Shaq's private study. Surrounded by dusty trophies and forgotten plaques, Shaq found her there one night, curled so small he barely recognized the fierce spirit he had fallen for. He knelt down, gently brushing a lock of hair from her face. Her eyes fluttered open, heavy with exhaustion. "You don't have to hide here," he said, voice breaking in the middle. "This is your home too." She gave a sad, almost apologetic smile. "Is it?" she whispered, the words so soft they almost disappeared. Shaq sat beside her, heart shattering. He realized that love alone could not undo years of being invisible. It could not erase the truth that in this glittering world of cameras and contracts, Cassandra was seen as a mistake he refused to correct. He made changes. He canceled interviews, turned down events, shut out friends who couldn't look him in the eye without judgment leaking through. He poured his energy into building a fortress around her, protecting her from the tide rising against them. But the world has a way of finding cracks in even the thickest walls. One rainy afternoon, a letter arrived. No return address. Thick, expensive paper that smelled faintly of expensive cologne and malice. Inside, a single line written in an elegant, cruel hand. "You don't know who she really is." Shaq stared at the words, a cold sickness coiling in his gut. He crushed the letter in his fist, but its poison had already seeped in. He told himself it was a lie, an attack from jealous enemies. But late at night, lying awake beside Cassandra's small, motionless figure, doubts crept through him like smoke through a cracked window. Who was Cassandra Reed before the streets claimed her? What did she run from? And why, after all this time, did she still refuse to talk about it? In the weeks that followed, Shaq noticed things he had once explained away. A scar on her wrist, thin and deliberate. The way she flinched whenever police sirens wailed nearby. The nightmares that sometimes tore her from sleep. Her body shaking in silent terror. He told himself love meant trust, that he had vowed to protect her without conditions. But the whispers outside his home had found their way into his bloodstream. Doubt gnawed at him, steady and patient, wearing down the certainty he had once held like armor. Curtis called again, this time not as a manager but as an old friend. His voice over the phone was low, serious, almost pleading. Shaq, you have to look into her past. You have to protect yourself. Shaq hung up without replying, but the seed was planted. One evening after Cassandra had gone to sleep curled on the study floor, Shaq stood alone in the grand hallway, lined with portraits of victories past. His reflection in the polished marble floor looked back at him, larger than life, yet hollow inside. Outside, the world raged on, hungry for his downfall. Inside, the woman he had vowed to stand by kept secrets deeper than any he had ever faced on a basketball court. And somewhere in the growing darkness of doubt, Shaq realized the game he had entered wasn't about reputation or love anymore. It was about survival. The morning had started like any other since Cassandra had entered Shaq's world. Slow, cautious, with tension humming just beneath the surface of the mansion's gold-plated calm, Shaq moved through his day with the mechanical precision of a man trying to pretend his life hadn't tilted off its axis. Meetings, workouts, charity calls, he did them all. But his mind never strayed far from the small figure who now haunted his home with a silence heavier than stone. An old friend, one of the few who still dared reach out, invited him to a low-key art exhibit downtown. It was supposed to be discreet, no press, just a few collectors and friends gathered in a converted warehouse that smelled of old wood and fresh paint. Shaq agreed, almost grateful for the excuse to breathe outside the suffocating walls of his estate. Cassandra declined to join him, as she always did when the world beyond the gates called. The event was quiet, civilized. Shaq moved among sculptures and oil paintings, nodding politely, offering practiced smiles. But everywhere he went, he felt it. A tightening of conversation as he approached, the sideways glances, the quick hushed murmurs. He knew he had become an uncomfortable subject, a warning whispered from behind manicured hands. It was near the end of the evening, as he stood alone examining a sculpture that looked like a man caught halfway between crumbling and soaring, that it happened. A man approached, sharp suit, expensive watch, a smile just a little too knowing. Shaq didn't recognize him, but something about his presence set Shaq's instincts on edge. The man stood beside him for a long moment, pretending to study the art. Then, in a voice low enough that it barely disturbed the air between them, he said, "Beautiful piece. Sad though, like watching someone fight a battle they already lost." Shaq nodded stiffly, uninterested in small talk. But the man continued, voice casual, almost bored. "Funny thing about battles, you never really know who you're fighting, until it's too late. Sometimes it's the person standing right beside you." Shaq turned slowly to face him, meeting the stranger's gaze. There was no direct threat there. No name, no accusation, but the meaning hit Shaq harder than any fist. Before he could respond, the man smiled politely, murmured something about needing a drink, and melted back into the crowd, leaving Shaq alone with a heart pounding hard enough to hurt. The drive home felt endless. The city lights blurred past, but Shaq barely noticed them. The man's words clawed at his mind, stirring up every doubt he had tried so hard to silence. Cassandra had been an enigma from the start, strong yet broken, open yet secretive. He had told himself her silences were scars, not betrayals. But what if he had been wrong? What if the sadness in her eyes wasn't just the residue of suffering, but the shadow of something far darker? He found her in the library, curled in an armchair, an unread book resting against her knees. She looked up when he entered, offering a small, uncertain smile. Shaq wanted to cross the room, to pull her into his arms, to erase the stranger's words with the solid truth of her presence. But something in him hesitated, a crack forming in the blind faith he had wrapped around her like a shield. Cassandra's smile faltered as she sensed the shift in him. She set the book down, standing awkwardly, as if expecting an interrogation. Shaq said nothing. Instead, he turned away, murmuring something about being tired, about needing to think. He hated the distance, but couldn't find the strength to close it. Later that night, while Cassandra slept fitfully, Shaq sat alone in the vast emptiness of his master bedroom, staring at the ceiling as doubt gnawed deeper into him. The stranger's words had planted a seed he couldn't uproot. He needed answers. He needed to know if the woman he had risked everything for was really the salvation he believed her to be, or the ruin everyone else warned of. The next day, almost by accident, Shaq stumbled onto something he could not ignore. He had gone to retrieve Cassandra's jacket from the back porch where she had left it draped over a chair. It was an old, battered thing, pockets torn and stitched back together with the stubbornness of survival. As he shook it out, a small folded piece of paper slipped from the lining and fluttered to the ground. Shaq picked it up, heart hammering against his ribs. It was a scrap, torn hastily from something larger, the edges frayed. The handwriting was small, cramped, almost desperate. "They're still looking. If you're reading this, run." No signature, no date, just those 7 words, heavy with fear and finality. Shaq stood frozen, the note burning against his palm. Questions crashed over him like a rising tide. Who was still looking? What had Cassandra run from? Why had she hidden this warning so carefully in a jacket she still wore? He didn't confront her immediately. Instead, he watched. For days, he observed her with a new, sharper lens, cataloging every twitch, every evasion, every half-truth she didn't even realize she was telling. Cassandra never used her real last name when ordering groceries or signing for deliveries. She flinched at the sight of police cruisers. She avoided cameras like they carried death, instead of flashes. Shaq's protectiveness warred violently with a growing sense of betrayal. He wanted to believe she had good reasons, that whatever she was hiding was born of necessity, not malice. But the cracks in the mirror could no longer be denied. The woman he had married wasn't just broken by poverty. She was hiding from something far larger, far more dangerous. One night, unable to sleep, Shaq sat outside on the stone steps of his estate, the city a distant blur of neon and noise. Cassandra found him there, barefoot, arms wrapped around herself as if warding off ghosts only she could see.
"You okay?"
she asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. Shaq looked up at her, seeing not the fragile waif the world pitied or the fierce survivor he admired, but a woman cloaked in mysteries he wasn't sure he could survive uncovering. "I don't know," he said truthfully. Cassandra hesitated, then sat beside him, close but not touching. They watched the night roll by in silence, the weight of unspoken things pressing harder between them than any words ever could. Shaq realized, sitting there with her, that the question wasn't whether Cassandra loved him. He believed, deep down, that she did in her own battered, beautiful way. The real question was whether love could survive the truths she was too terrified to tell, and whether, when those truths finally clawed their way into the light, they would destroy them both. The cracks in the mirror were growing, splintering into something that would soon be impossible to ignore. Shaq didn't know it yet, but the life he thought he had saved was about to drag them both into a storm far bigger than either of them could imagine. Shaq sat in the back of his blacked-out SUV, the city lights blurring into ribbons of white and gold as they sped down the expressway. His fists were clenched on his lap, knuckles turning pale against his dark skin. His mind, usually calm like a still lake, now stormed with doubts he couldn't shake. Cassandra sat next to him, her head tilted against the window, breathing softly as if she was somewhere far away. Shaq stared at her reflection, trying to read the secrets hidden behind her closed eyes. It had been 2 weeks since they said their secret vows under the faded canopy of a dying oak tree in Brookshire Park. 2 weeks of stolen moments, of quiet smiles, of pretending that the world outside didn't exist. But the whispers had gotten louder. The glances from his team had grown sharper. And then there was the note, a single scrap of paper, crammed between the inner lining of Cassandra's thrift store jacket. No name, no explanation, just a chilling sentence. "She is not who you think she is." Shaq's gut twisted. He knew he shouldn't pry. She was his wife now. Trust was sacred. But something in that note clung to him like smoke, seeping into every crack of his heart. Against his better judgment, Shaq had made a call, a private investigator he knew from his wilder days, a man who specialized in digging up truths best left buried. Tonight, that man had sent word. He had found something. Something big. The SUV pulled into an underground garage, the heavy doors sliding shut behind them. Shaq stepped out, his sneakers scraping against the concrete floor. A single figure leaned against a support beam, half shrouded in shadow. Damian Clark, the man he had hired. Damian nodded, his face grim. "You sure you want to hear this?" Damian asked without preamble. Shaq didn't flinch. "Tell me." Damian handed over a thick manila folder. Shaq opened it with steady hands, but a heart that hammered wildly against his ribs. Inside were photographs, legal documents, grainy newspaper clippings, and a birth certificate. Cassandra Elise Reed. Born to Victor and Eleanor Reed. Names Shaq recognized immediately. The Reeds weren't just wealthy. They were dynasty material. Old money. Power players hidden behind non-profits and corporate fronts. On the surface, they were saints. Behind the scenes, they were rumored to be something far darker. Shaq flipped through the papers. Cassandra had attended the best schools. She had been engaged once, to a senator's son no less. A gilded life, preordained for her. Until everything burned down. Damian's voice was low, almost reluctant. 6 years ago, there was a scandal, drug allegations, embezzlement, abuse. Cassandra was the whistleblower, but the story never saw daylight. Her own family buried it, made her the scapegoat. Publicly, they claimed she had mental health issues, fabricated accusations, disowned her. Quietly, Shaq's stomach turned. He stared at a newspaper headline from years ago. Heiress disappears after public meltdown. There was a photo of Cassandra, younger, polished, hollow-eyed, nothing like the fierce, broken woman he knew now. He could barely breathe. "She never told me," he said hoarsely. Damian shook his head. "She probably thought you wouldn't believe her. Or worse, that you'd pity her." Shaq closed the folder with trembling fingers. His vision swam. He remembered all the little things. The way Cassandra flinched when someone mentioned politics. The way she avoided any luxury. How she wore her pain like armor. It had all been right in front of him, and he hadn't seen it. Back in the car, Cassandra stirred as he slid beside her. She blinked up at him, her eyes soft and unsure. Shaq wanted to scream, to demand answers, but when he opened his mouth, only silence came out. Because he understood now. She wasn't hiding her past to deceive him. She was protecting herself from the world. From him. The next morning, he couldn't pretend anymore. As they sat at the tiny kitchen table in the modest apartment they had rented, the folder sat between them like a loaded gun. Cassandra's hands trembled as she reached for it. She skimmed the contents and then sagged back in her chair, her face crumpling not in fear but in resignation. "You found out," she whispered. Shaq nodded stiffly. "Why didn't you tell me?" Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "Because I wanted something real," she said, voice thick. "Not someone saving me, not someone loving me out of pity." Shaq's fists clenched. "You think that's what this is?" She laughed bitterly. "Isn't it? That's what they all said. That no one would ever love me without an agenda, without a reason." Shaq stared at her, the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. He realized then that Cassandra had been carrying this burden alone for years. A ghost among the living, invisible and unwanted. "I loved you before I knew any of this," he said, his voice rough. "And knowing it, it just makes me love you more." For a moment, the walls she had built around herself seemed to waver. But then she shook her head, smiling sadly. "It's not that simple, Shaq. You're in danger now. They'll come after you. My family, they don't lose." The fear in her voice wasn't for herself. It was for him. Shaq leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Let them come." The days that followed were a blur of whispered conversations, tense phone calls, and looming threats. Word had gotten out somehow. Anonymous tips to gossip blogs. A sudden interest in Shaq's mysterious new wife. Paparazzi camped outside their building. Sponsors called Shaq's manager in a panic. "This could ruin you," they warned. Shaq didn't care. The only thing that mattered was the woman standing beside him, her chin high, her hands steady even as the world tried to pull her under again. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset from their balcony, Cassandra finally spoke about the night. Everything changed. "My father," she began, voice hollow, "used me, groomed me for politics. I was supposed to marry into power, create alliances. I was a pawn." Shaq's jaw tightened. "When I found out about the money laundering, the blackmail, the things they did to people, I couldn't stay silent. I thought if I told the truth, it would set me free." Her smile was a razor blade. "Instead, they destroyed me." Shaq reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I slept on benches. Cassandra continued. 8 out of dumpsters. Hid from bounty hunters my father hired to bring me back for treatment. She shuddered. Every night, I prayed someone would see me. Not as a scandal, not as a project, just as a person. Shaq swallowed the lump in his throat. I see you, he said fiercely. I see you, Cassandra. And he meant it. Every scar, every crack, every beautiful broken piece of her. Later that night, as they lay entwined under the battered quilt, Cassandra whispered, they're going to fight dirty. They'll use everything against you. Shaq kissed her forehead. Let them. I've fought my whole life. I'm not afraid to fight for you. For the first time, Cassandra slept peacefully in his arms. No nightmares to chase her. But deep inside, Shaq knew the real battle hadn't even started yet, and the wolves that hunted them would stop at nothing to tear them apart. Still, he tightened his arms around her and closed his eyes, ready to face whatever came next. Because for the first time in his life, Shaquille Big Shaq Harris had found something worth losing everything for. The rain battered the windows like an impatient guest, as Shaq sat across from Cassandra in their dimly lit apartment. A single lamp cast long shadows across the room, the kind that seemed to grow with every unspoken word between them. Cassandra's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white, her posture unnaturally stiff. Shaq had seen her brave the cruelty of paparazzi, had watched her smile when the world tried to shame her. But tonight she looked smaller, more fragile than he had ever seen her. I think it's time you knew everything, she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes didn't meet his. They stayed fixed on a stain in the carpet, as if facing him might break whatever fragile courage she had managed to gather. Shaq didn't press her. He simply waited, his heart beating an uneasy rhythm in his chest. He knew instinctively that whatever Cassandra was about to say would change everything between them. Again, my name was never supposed to be Cassandra Reed, she began, her voice flat, mechanical, as if reciting a story she had spent years trying to forget. I was born Cassandra Elise Whitmore. My father, Charles Whitmore, is a name that can buy silence in every major newsroom on both coasts. My mother, Evelyn, was no better. They didn't just control wealth. They controlled narratives, elections, people's lives. Shaq leaned forward slightly, catching the way her voice trembled at the edges. She wasn't dramatizing this. She wasn't seeking pity. She was dragging ghosts out of the graveyard of her past, one by one, and forcing herself to look them in the eye. They raised me like an asset, she continued. Every smile, every handshake, every charity gala, it was all orchestrated. I wasn't a daughter, I was a brand extension, groomed to marry power, to secure alliances that would make them untouchable. Shaq felt anger coil hot in his stomach, but he forced it down. This was her story to tell. His anger could wait. I tried to play along, Cassandra admitted, her mouth twisting bitterly. I tried to be the daughter they wanted, until I found out the price they were willing to pay. Her hands moved unconsciously to her wrists, as if feeling for old shackles. Shaq noticed but said nothing. There were deals with cartels, money laundering through children's hospitals, bribes, cover-ups, things that don't just break the law, they break souls. And when I stumbled onto the wrong document, when I saw the proof, I thought I could stop it. Her laugh was brittle, humorless. I was so naive. Shaq reached out, placing his hand palm up on the table between them. Cassandra hesitated, then laid her trembling fingers over his. I gathered evidence, she said. Emails, recordings, bank statements. Enough to bury them all. I went to the authorities first. I trusted the system. She shook her head slowly, as if still unable to believe her own stupidity. 2 days later, I was declared mentally unstable by court order. They forged psychiatric reports, made it look like I had a psychotic break. Shaq's chest ached at the thought of her. Isolated, discredited, gaslit by her own blood. They sent me to a private facility in the countryside, she whispered. Not a hospital. A prison with wallpaper and pretty nurses. I was drugged, threatened. They told me if I didn't recant, if I didn't play the good little girl again, I'd never see the outside world. Shaq squeezed her hand, grounding her, letting her know she wasn't alone anymore. I escaped, Cassandra said. One night, when a sympathetic orderly left a door unlocked, I ran until my feet bled. I thought if I could just get far enough away, they'd leave me alone. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely.
I changed my name. I lived in shelters. under bridges, in bus stations, always moving, always looking over my shoulder. And every time I started to feel safe, something would happen. A friend would get threatened. A job would disappear. I realized they were still watching me, still trying to crush me into silence.
Shaq's throat felt tight. This woman who slept curled up against him at night, who laughed shyly at his terrible jokes, who kissed him like he was the last good thing in a cruel world, had lived a life that would have shattered most people.
"Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, not accusingly, but with aching sadness.
Cassandra finally met his eyes, hers raw and open. "Because if I let you in," she said, "they could use you to get to me, and because I was afraid you'd see me as broken, as damaged goods." Shaq shook his head, fierce with feeling. "You're not broken," he said. "You're the strongest person I've ever met." For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the steady drum of rain against the glass. Finally, Cassandra pulled something from around her neck, a tiny battered locket. She opened it and placed it in Shaq's hand. Inside was a microchip, smaller than his thumbnail. "This," she said, voice shaking, "is everything. All the proof. Everything I couldn't show anyone before." Shaq stared at it, feeling the enormity of it settle on his shoulders. The power in his palm could tear apart some of the most powerful people in the country, but it would also paint a target on their backs bigger than either of them could imagine. "Helping me," Cassandra said, her voice almost inaudible, "could cost you everything. Your career, your freedom, maybe even your life." Shaq closed his fingers around the locket. His decision was already made. "Then it'll be the best thing I ever lost," he said simply. Cassandra's face crumpled, a sob escaping her lips, and Shaq was around the table in an instant, pulling her into his arms. She clung to him like a drowning woman, and he held her tighter, promising silently that no matter what storms came next, he would not let her go. They stayed like that for a long time, the storm outside a pale echo of the one that raged in their hearts. The days that followed were a masterclass in calculated risk. Shaq moved Cassandra to a safer location, a small, nondescript house owned under a shell company. He severed unnecessary ties, tightened security, prepared for war. Every night they strategized who to trust, what evidence to release, how to stay one step ahead. Every morning he woke up beside her and remembered why he was doing it. Cassandra was no longer just surviving. She was fighting back. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by something fierce, something unbreakable. And Shaq, who had once believed his greatest battles were fought on courts and stages, now understood that real strength wasn't in trophies or contracts. It was in standing by the people you loved, when the world tried to tear them apart. One night, as they mapped out their next move, Cassandra looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "You could still walk away," she said. "Pretend you never knew me. No one would blame you." Shaq smiled, a slow, unshakable thing. "They'd have to kill me first." Cassandra laughed then, a real ringing laugh that filled the room like music. And for the first time since the nightmare began, Shaq saw a glimpse of the woman she might have been, if her life had been different. And he vowed, silently and fiercely, to give her that life, whatever it cost him. The golden cage she had been born into might have turned to ash, but together they would build something better, something real. Not a cage, a kingdom, built on truth, love, and the unbreakable chains they forged together in the fire. The storm didn't announce itself with thunder. It came silently in the way headlines started mutating overnight, twisting Shaq's name into something unrecognizable. It came in the way people he trusted stopped returning his calls. It came in the way the board members of his brand empire suddenly wanted emergency meetings. It came in betrayal, wrapped in smiles, delivered like poison into every crevice of his carefully built world. Shaq sat in his downtown office, surrounded by the sterile hum of monitors broadcasting the carnage. On one screen, a popular entertainment show dissected his sudden marriage to a controversial mystery woman. On another, a corporate lawyer outlined a lawsuit filed against his charitable foundation, citing mismanagement of funds. Photos of him and Cassandra flashed everywhere, edited, distorted, magnified to look scandalous. It didn't matter that none of it was true. In the court of public opinion, truth had always been optional. His phone buzzed angrily across the polished wood desk. "Another dropped sponsor! Another betrayal!" Shaq swiped the call away, staring blankly at the growing pile of contracts demanding cancellation fees. The ceaseless bleeding of his life's work. The worst blow came not from enemies, but from the ones he called family. Jerome, his oldest friend and business partner, sat across from him now, his hands folded, his mouth tight with guilt. Shaq knew what was coming before Jerome even spoke. "They're offering me a deal," Jerome said, not meeting his eyes. "If I distance myself, if I denounce you publicly, they'll save my share of the company." Shaq leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning under his weight. He studied Jerome, not the words but the man who had once slept in his mother's guest room when his own family threw him out, who had once sworn loyalty thicker than blood. "And you're considering it," Shaq said quietly. Jerome flinched, and in that flinch, Shaq had his answer. "They're not just coming after you, man," Jerome said helplessly. "They're coming after all of us. Anyone who stands with you. You don't understand the kind of power her family has." "I understand perfectly," Shaq cut in, his voice a blade. Jerome sagged, shame clouding his face. "I'm sorry, Shaq. I have a family to think about." Shaq nodded slowly, the motion deliberate, final. "Then go think about them. Somewhere else." Jerome left without another word. The office door clicked shut behind him, like the final nail in a coffin. Shaq exhaled, long and slow. He wasn't angry, not really. Betrayal was the currency of fear, and fear was something the Whitmore family had minted in endless supply. Later that night, Cassandra found him on the balcony, the city sprawling out beneath him like a glittering, heartless sea. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if the cold was something she deserved to feel. "You're losing everything because of me," she said, her voice carrying a guilt so heavy it bent the air between them. Shaq didn't turn around. He couldn't. Not yet. If he did, he might see the pain in her eyes, and do something foolish, like agree to what he already knew she was about to say. "You don't have to do this," Cassandra continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can let me go. Say it was a mistake, that I tricked you. They'll believe it. They want to believe it." Shaq gripped the balcony railing so hard his knuckles ached. "And what happens to you then?" "I survive," she said, and Shaq heard the lie buried in the strength of her voice. He turned finally, slowly, and faced her. Her face was pale in the moonlight, her hair a halo of silver. She looked like something fragile and ethereal, and yet somehow she also looked indestructible. "You don't just survive, Cass," he said. "You live with me, no matter what it costs." Tears glimmered in her eyes, but she blinked them away fiercely. "They won't stop," she said. "Even if we fight back, they'll keep coming. They'll find ways to make you a villain. They'll dig up mistakes you never even made. They'll ruin you." Shaq shrugged. A slow, reckless motion. "Maybe I deserve to be ruined, if it means standing by the only real thing I've ever had." Cassandra crossed the space between them, her fingers finding his, her grip tighter than he expected from someone so slight. "I don't want you to be collateral damage," she said fiercely. "I can't be the reason you lose your dreams." Shaq pulled her close, tucking her against his chest, feeling the wild hammer of her heart against his ribs. "My dreams changed," he said into her hair. "Now they start and end with you." The city rumbled below them, uncaring, relentless. Somewhere out there, the wolves were gathering, sharpening their teeth. Shaq could feel them, sense their hunger for his downfall. But here, in this moment, he was unafraid. The first real attack came the next day. An anonymous source leaked a doctored video, edited to make it look like Shaq had bribed a city official to secure contracts for his businesses. It went viral within hours. By afternoon, 2 major sponsors had publicly severed ties, releasing statements about maintaining integrity and zero tolerance for unethical behavior. Shaq's phone rang non-stop. Reporters, lawyers, friends who weren't sure if they should still call themselves friends. At a hastily called press conference, Shaq stood before the flashing cameras, calm in a way that unnerved even his own legal team. He didn't flinch when asked about the video. He didn't stutter when asked about Cassandra. "Believe what you want," Shaq said simply, his deep voice cutting through the noise. "I know the truth, and the truth doesn't scare me." The reporters pressed harder, their questions morphing into accusations, their hunger for blood palpable. "Is it true your wife was involved in the embezzlement scandal 6 years ago? Are you protecting a fugitive? How much were you paid to marry her?" Shaq smiled then. Not a pleasant smile, but the slow, dangerous kind that said he was done playing nice. "You want a scandal?" he said, his voice rising. "Here's your headline. I married the only person who's ever stood by me for who I am, not for what I can give them. You call that a scandal? Go ahead. Write it in bold." The room exploded in a flurry of shouted questions, but Shaq walked away, leaving them chasing his shadow. Back at the safe house, Cassandra waited, her face pale but composed. When he entered, she flew into his arms, holding him tighter than ever. "They're going to hate you," she whispered. Shaq chuckled against her hair. "Let them. I'm not here to be loved by the world." But even as he said it, he knew the war was only just beginning. His bank accounts were frozen the next week, under the guise of investigative audits. A fake witness surfaced, claiming Shaq had paid him to fix charity auctions. Cassandra's old enemies leaked fabricated diaries, portraying her as a manipulative gold digger. Every newspaper, every gossip blog, every whisper on the street painted a darker picture of them both. Friends abandoned him. Business partners distanced themselves. Invitations dried up. TV anchors who once called him a hero now called him a disgrace. And still Shaq stood tall, lonely, bleeding, but unbowed. One evening, as they huddled together in the small living room of their rented refuge, Cassandra pulled back slightly, studying him with a fierce, desperate tenderness. "You don't have to be strong all the time," she said softly. Shaq cupped her face in his hands. "If I fall, you fall. And I'm not about to let that happen." The wolves howled louder every day. But Shaq, standing atop the crumbling ruins of his empire, understood something they never would. You can only break a man who believes the world made him. You can't break a man who remade himself standing on the ashes. And Shaq, Big Shaq, son of Lucille Harris, fighter, dreamer, believer in impossible things, was just getting started. Shaq understood that the court of public opinion had already passed its judgment. He could see it in the way people looked at him when he entered the courtroom. Some with pity, some with suspicion. The stain on his name wouldn't wash off easily, no matter how many truths he uncovered. But this battle wasn't just about clearing their names. It was about reclaiming their humanity. On the final day of testimony, Cassandra took the stand. The room held its breath as she walked to the witness box, her steps measured, her head high. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, only a simple blue dress, the same shade as the sky on a clear, unbroken day. Cassandra's testimony wasn't dramatic. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She simply told the truth, piece by brutal piece, about the life she had been bred into, about the choices she had made, about the nights she had slept on the cold ground, hiding from the people who were supposed to love her. "I was not broken," Cassandra said, her voice clear, carrying to every corner of the room. "I was discarded, but I built myself back, brick by bloody brick." Shaq watched her, pride swelling in his chest until it felt like it might crack his ribs. Whatever happened here, whatever verdict was delivered, she had already won the only battle that mattered. The prosecution tried to rattle her. They threw every ugly accusation they could find, every half-truth, every bitter whisper. Cassandra faced them all with unshakable grace. When asked why she hadn't come forward sooner, she smiled a small, sad smile. "Because truth," she said, "doesn't always set you free. Sometimes, it makes you a target." When asked why she had stayed silent when Shaq began to lose everything, her voice broke for the first time. "Because I love him," she said simply, "and because he chose me when I had nothing to offer but my broken pieces." When the closing arguments wrapped, the jury was sent out for deliberations. Shaq and Cassandra sat side by side at the defense table, their fingers intertwined under the table where no one could see. Hours passed. The courthouse buzzed with rumors and speculation. Reporters filed stories in real time. Shaq ignored it all. The only thing he saw was the woman next to him, her strength and vulnerability shining brighter than any spotlight could ever capture. When the jury finally returned, the room held its breath. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, stood and cleared her throat. "In the matter of Whitmore Enterprises versus Shaquille Harris and Cassandra Reed," she said, "we find in favor of the defendants." The air seemed to crackle. Shock rippled through the Whitmore camp. Shaq heard gasps, felt the glares of those who had once ruled unchallenged. But none of it mattered. Not compared to the feeling of Cassandra's hand squeezing his, grounding him, saving him. Damages were awarded. Apologies were demanded. The Whitmore empire, though still massive, would bleed for a long time. But Shaq knew this was not a fairy tale ending. Their names would forever be tied to this war. Some doors would stay closed. Some wounds would never fully heal. The world would move on, as it always did, searching for its next scandal. But Shaq and Cassandra, they had something the world couldn't touch. Something built not on power, not on appearances, but on the kind of truth that survived even the fiercest storms. As they walked out of the courthouse, cameras flashing, reporters shouting, Cassandra leaned into him and whispered, "We did it." Shaq smiled, the sun warming his face for the first time in what felt like years. "No," he said, pulling her closer. "You did it. We survived." And survival, in a world that wanted them broken, was the sweetest victory of all. Victory tasted nothing like Shaq imagined. It wasn't sweet. It wasn't triumphant. It was hollow, laced with exhaustion so deep that it seemed carved into his bones. As he and Cassandra exited the courthouse into the cool breath of evening, the world outside felt disjointed, almost dreamlike. Reporters barked questions, flashbulbs burst against the twilight, but Shaq barely heard any of it. Cassandra's hand clutched his, grounding him as much as he was anchoring her, but they both knew the real battle was not yet over. For the next week they lived in a daze. Officially they had won. Unofficially their reputations still bled from 1,000 unseen cuts. Brands were cautious, friends were distant, and online, the war raged louder than ever. Some called them survivors, others called them con artists who got lucky. Cassandra rarely checked the news, but Shaq saw it all. He absorbed it silently, a soldier taking arrows for a queen who didn't deserve to be wounded 1 second longer. Late one night, while Cassandra slept fitfully beside him, Shaq sat at the kitchen table, a battered wooden box sitting heavily in front of him. It had arrived earlier that day, delivered by a courier who refused to give a name. There was no return address, no note, just the box, aged and cracked, smelling faintly of cedar and old secrets. For hours Shaq had stared at it, heart pounding. Something about it felt important, dangerous even. But he hadn't dared open it without Cassandra. He reached over now, brushing a lock of hair from her forehead. She stirred, blinking up at him, her expression clouded by lingering nightmares. "You okay?" she murmured. "I need you to see something," Shaq said softly. Cassandra sat up, her body tense as she noticed the box. Without a word she rose and joined him at the table. Shaq lifted the lid carefully, as if expecting the past itself to come roaring out. Inside lay a velvet pouch, frayed at the edges. Cassandra's hands trembled slightly as she lifted it out and untied the string. A glint of gold caught the light. A locket, old but intricately crafted, its surface etched with the Whitmore family crest. Cassandra gasped, her face going pale. "That's my mother's," she whispered. "It was supposed to be destroyed." Shaq frowned. "Destroyed?" She nodded, voice tight. "After I ran, my father ordered all personal items linked to me or my mother erased. Photos, letters, jewelry, anything that could humanize us." Shaq reached out, prying open the locket. Inside was a tiny compartment, barely visible to the naked eye. Nestled within it was a memory card. Cassandra's hands shook as she slid it free and inserted it into Shaq's laptop. Files popped up instantly, dozens of them. Videos, documents, audio recordings, undeniable evidence of the Whitmore family's crimes, secret accounts, bribes, kidnapping orders, proof that Cassandra had not just told the truth, she had underplayed it. There was also something else, a confession video, a much younger Charles Whitmore, drunk and unguarded, boasting to a private associate about framing his daughter, about how no one would ever believe a broken little girl. Cassandra pressed a hand to her mouth, tears slipping down her cheeks as Shaq stared, stunned, at the screen. It wasn't just evidence. It was a weapon powerful enough to burn the entire Whitmore dynasty to ash. "Where did this come from?" she whispered. Shaq shook his head. "I don't know, but someone wanted you to have it." For a long moment, they simply sat there, the weight of the discovery pressing down on them. This could clear her name beyond dispute. This could destroy the people who had tried to erase her, but it would also paint an even bigger target on their backs. As dawn crept over the horizon, Cassandra finally spoke. "We have to release it." Shaq looked at her, seeing not the broken girl she once was, but the warrior she had become. "You're She nodded. "They built their empire on lies. It's time the world saw the truth." The next 24 hours blurred into motion. Elliot, their lawyer, worked through the night preparing legal pathways to leak the evidence securely. Trusted journalists were contacted, ones who had been blackballed for refusing to play along with the system. The memory card was duplicated, encrypted, and distributed through anonymous channels to ensure that if anything happened to them, the information would still surface. At precisely noon the following day, the files dropped. The world exploded. News outlets scrambled to verify the authenticity, but it was irrefutable. Major networks interrupted broadcasts to cover the breaking story. Online platforms overflowed with outrage, disbelief, and horror. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves. Corporations disavowed the Whitmore name. Protests broke out in cities Shaq had never even visited. The Whitmores issued desperate denials. But the damage was done. Investigations were launched. Arrest warrants were rumored. For the first time, the untouchables were not just bleeding. They were drowning. Shaq watched the news unfold, with grim satisfaction. Cassandra sat beside him, her hand in his, silent but trembling with an emotion that looked suspiciously like hope. They had won, and yet the victory tasted bittersweet. The attacks intensified before they slowed. Death threats arrived daily. Business opportunities remained non-existent. Shaq's endorsements were gone for good. His bank accounts were still under review, delayed by bureaucracy and malice. Cassandra became a symbol, beloved by some, hated by others. Their lives would never return to what they once were. One evening, as they sat on the back porch of a borrowed safe house, Cassandra turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You lost everything because of me," she said, not for the first time. Shaq reached out, brushing his thumb along her cheek. "No," he said, "I lost everything that didn't matter, and I found you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. "I would understand if you resented me. I would understand if you regretted all of it." Shaq chuckled low in his throat, the sound rough but genuine. "If this is regret," he said, "then I never want to know what contentment feels like." They leaned into each other, finding solace not in the world's approval, but in the knowledge that they had chosen love over fear, truth over comfort. Their wounds were real, their scars deep, but they wore them like armor now. A few days later, Shaq received a letter, handwritten, formal, yet deeply personal. It was from the judge who had presided over their trial. "You have reminded this country that justice is not a gift granted by the powerful," the letter read. "It is a right fought for by the brave. History will not forget you." Shaq folded the letter carefully, tucking it away in a drawer alongside the locket, the memory card, and the few precious reminders of a war they had survived. The world moved on eventually, as it always does, hungry for newer scandals, fresher blood. But Shaq and Cassandra remained, standing together amid the ashes of everything that had tried to destroy them. It wasn't the life they had dreamed of. It was better. It was real. And in a world built on shifting sand, they had found bedrock in each other. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of fire and gold, Shaq looked over at Cassandra and realized something profound. The dawn wasn't something you waited for. It was something you fought to create. And they had done it, together. He had seen too clearly now what real wealth looked like. It wasn't measured in zeros on a check or followers on a screen. It was measured in the small, stubborn victories. The kid who graduated high school when no one believed he would. The girl who painted her first mural because someone finally gave her a wall and a chance. One particularly cold winter evening, Shaq and Cassandra hosted a small event at the center. No press, no influencers, just the kids, some music, and a feast cooked by volunteers. As he watched Cassandra laugh, cheeks flushed from dancing, Shaq felt a deep resonant peace settle over him. This was it. Not the noise. Not the fame. The love stronger than names, stronger than power, stronger than fear. As the first snowfall dusted the ground outside, Shaq realized that the world could still try to rename them, redefine them, bury them under new scandals or old grudges. But it didn't matter, because names were labels. And love, real love, was a force of nature. Later, as they locked up the center, Cassandra slipped her hand into his and looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Whatever comes next," she said, "we face it together." Shaq smiled, pulling her close, feeling the heartbeat of something larger than both of them pulsing between their joined hands. "Always," he whispered against her temple. "Always." And with the first light of a new dawn breaking over the city, they stepped into tomorrow. Two survivors, two warriors, two hearts bound, not by the names they had been given, but by the love they had chosen. The kind of love that didn't need validation. The kind of love that rewrote destinies. The kind of love that turned ashes into hope. And this time, no one could take it from them. When the world breaks you, what you build next defines who you are. Stay with us. where truth fights louder than power, and every story dares you to believe again. Because some battles are bigger than fame, some victories are written in scars, and the next chapter is just getting started.